In this video, we are going to show you how to do subnetting. I am Joshua Tagle and my teammates are Melody T. Basio and Joceylin Manalo. But first, let us define what is subnetting. A subnetwork or subnet is a logical, visible subdivision of an IP network. The process of dividing a network into two or more is called subnetting. Computers that belong to subnet are addressed with a common, identical, most significant bit group in their IP address. CIDR or classes interdomain routing is the form in which routing prefix is expressed. This is an example of an IP address. This is the network part, host part, and the subnet mask. In this table, we're going to see the classes of IP address. The class A, class B, class C, class D, and class E. In class A, the first part of address A 0 to 127. In class B, the first part address is 128 to 191. In class C, 192 to 223. In class D, 224 to 239. In class E, 240 to 255. In class A, the maximum number of nodes is 16,777,214. In class B, 65,534. In class C, 254. The the default subnet mask of class A is 255.0.0.0. In class B, 255.255.0.0. In class C, 255.255.255.0.
Let's begin. Alright, so let's start. Okay. Okay, we have here the subnetting table, and we will be using this table as our guide to solve a problem. Okay. The subnetting table consists of the group size, GS, okay. GS stands for group size, SN stands for subnet, and CIDR stands for classless interdomain routing. Alright, and then here are the entries of subnetting that we have to look for. Okay, so let's start solving. Alright, for example, we have here 187.1.1.45. Okay, and I will use /27 or decider 27. At first, we have to locate the /27 on the subnetting table. So this is our decider. So we have to look for /27, and there you go. So let's circle it. Alright. Next, after we locate, we have to get the GS. But before we getting the GS, we have to start at .0. Okay, .0. Okay, next, continue increment until we pass the target ID. Okay, so .0. Next to it is .32. Next to it is .64. And then there you go. That 45 is in between of 32 and 64. Right here. Okay, this time we passed the target ID between here 32 and 64. Remember the that 32, this number is the number before the target ID, before the target ID is our network ID. Therefore, our network ID is 187.1.1.32. Alright, next. Okay, next is that 64. Now, this number is our next network here. Remember, the IP after our target is the next network. Therefore, we have 187.1.1.64. Alright, there you go. Okay, next, broadcast IP. To locate or to look on our broadcast IP, we have to look on the IP, okay, here, on the IP before okay, you have to look for IP before next network. Okay, this is the next network. IP before the next network. Therefore, our broadcast IP is 187.1.1.63. Okay, 63 is before 64. Okay, next, our first host IP. To look on first host IP, we have to look the IP after network ID. Alright, so this is our network ID. We have that 32, so after 32 is 33. Therefore, we have 187, okay, 187.1.1.33. Alright, next we have the last host IP. Our last host IP is the IP before, okay, before broadcast. Okay, so here is our broadcast IP, that 63. The IP before that 63 is, okay, 187.1.1.62. Alright, there you go. Next, okay, we have two more. The number IP addresses and the ZIDR subnet conversion. Okay, the number IP addresses is also the same with the GS or the group size. So our group size for CIDR 27 is 32. Alright, so we have 32, but you have to subtract or less the 2 ID, which is the network ID, okay, and the broadcast IP. Okay, we have to less these 2. Alright, so we have 30 usable IP addresses. Remember, the network ID and the broadcast IP is not belong to the number of IP addresses usable. Okay, and then the CIDR or the subnet conversion, we have here the 255.224. Alright, there you go. Okay, once again, let's try a look here. Let's have a recap. Alright, so this is our subnetting table. Group size, subnet, CIDR, or the classless interdomain routing. We have the 7 entries to look for, 7 entries of subnetting: the network ID, the broadcast IP, first host IP, last host IP, next network, number IP addresses, and the CID or subnet conversion. Okay, so we have to solve the 187.1.1.45/27. First, you have to locate the /27 on the subnetting table. Okay, so this is our CIDR 27, which has the group size of 32. Alright, so after locating, we have to start .0 of that irrelevant octet. Okay, so start .0 and continue increment until we pass the target ID. .0, .34, .64. Therefore, this time we have passed the target ID, which is in between of .32 and .64. Remember, the .32 is the number, okay, the number before the target ID. The number before the target ID is our network ID, and the number after the network ID is our next network. Okay, remember? Okay, once again, the number before the target ID is .32. Therefore, our network ID is 187.1.1.32. This number, .64, is the number after the target ID. Okay, therefore, .64 is our next network, 187.1.1.64. Okay, next, the broadcast IP. Broadcast IP is the IP before the next network. Okay, so next network, this is our next network, 187.1.1.64. So before, the IP before this is the 187.1.1.63, which is our broadcast IP. Okay, next, we have the first host IP. To look first host IP, this is the IP after the network ID. Therefore, this is our network ID, 187.1.1.32. So our first host IP is 187.1.1.33. Last host IP, okay, this last host IP is the IP before the broadcast IP. Okay, our broadcast IP is 187.1.1.63. IP before that 63 is 187.1.1.62. That is our local last host IP. The next one is IP, number IP addresses. Okay, remember, number IP addresses is just the same as the group size. Alright, so our group size is 32. There you go. Okay, so now we have 32, but we have to less, or we have to subtract 2, which is the network ID and the broadcast IP. So 32 less 2 is 30 usable IP addresses. We have now 30 usable IP addresses. And last, our CIDR subnet conversion. Alright, there you go. We have 255.255.255.224 here. This is the 224. Okay, there you go. On the next video, we will show you how to do subnetting for Class C.
So here is another example, and the problem is, in your networking class, your instructor gave the class a sit work saying, here is the network ID 192.168.8.0/24. Kindly create 8 separate networks or subnets for our school. The 8 separate networks are for teacher's office, canteen, library, guard's office, registrar, stadium, USG office, and for public use. So here is the IP address. It's 192.168.8.0/24. So kung papansinin po nating mabuti, pasok siya sa range ng Class C. So, isa po siyang Class C na IP address. So, gawa po muna tayo ng subnetting table. So, mag-start sa 1, 2, gaya ng previous example, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. Hanggang 256 lang siya dahil ang ating class C, ang kanyang maximum number of nodes ay hanggang 254 lamang. So, host, 256, pabalik na pattern, 256, 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. At ang ating subnet mask ay /24, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. In the problem, says that you're going to create 8 separate networks. So from our subnetting table, we are going to create 8. So gagamitin po natin ng 8, 32, at 27. Ang ibig sabihin ng 8 ay magkakaroon ng ng 8 subnets. And then the 32 ay magkakaroon pa siya ng 32 total host IDs, including the network ID and the broadcast ID. And this is the new subnet mask para po sa ating bagong subnets. So, punta na po tayo sa ating table. Ang magiging default na network ID ay yung ating original na network ID. So, i-copy ko lang siya. Control V. Yung susunod po ay ito ang ating magiging reference. So, it's 32. 32. So, para makuha yung ating susunod na network ID, 32 plus 32. Mag-a-add lang po tayo ng 32 sa susunod na network ID. So, magiging 64. And continue hanggang magkaroon tayo ng 8 na bagong host ID, network ID. So, 64, 64, 96, 96, so B, copy-paste natin. Sunod sa 96 plus 32 is 128. 128 plus 32 is 160. Next, 160 plus 32 is 192. Next, 192 plus 32 is 224. So, yan. Ang magiging ating subnet na mask ay 27. So, 20 dash dash 27. So, copy-paste na lang natin siya. B, control B. P, control P. Control V. So, next, number of usable host. Ito po siya, 32. 32 minus network ID and broadcast ID. So, ang magiging number of usable host natin ay 30. 30 less yung network ID at saka broadcast ID. 30. So, next. So, punta po tayo sa ating broadcast ID. Ang ating pong broadcast ID ay reference ng susunod na network ID. So, pag ang network ID ay 32, ang ating pong broadcast ID ay 31. So, pag ang susunod po ay 64, ang ating pong broadcast ID ay magiging 63. 63. And so on. So, 96. Ang ating pong magiging broadcast ID ay 95. 95. Next, 128. Magiging broadcast ID natin ay, nasusundan nyo po ba? Ay magiging 127. Next, ang ating pong broadcast ID, ay network ID ay 160. So, ang ating pong broadcast ID ay 159. Sorry. 159. Next, 192. Ang ating pong magiging broadcast ID ay 191. Next, ang ating pong network ID ay 224. Ang ating broadcast ID ay magiging 223. Ang pinakahuli po nating broadcast ID ay 223 plus 223, kakalculate ko lang po, 223 ay magiging 255. So, 223 plus 32 is equals to 255. Okay? Next, punta po tayo sa host ID range. So, yung host ID range po natin ay in between network ID and broadcast ID. Network ID and broadcast ID. So, 192.168.8.1. 192.168.8.30. Ganon din po sa mga susunod. So, ika-copy-paste ko na lang po siya. Jovi 192.168.33.62. Nasusundan niyo po ba? 192.63. 94. Control V. 94. Next, 96. 97. 126. 26 ay in between 64, 97, and 127. Next, 129, 158, 58. Next, Control V. Copy-paste na po muna para mapabilis. 120, 160, 161, 61. Next, 190. Next, 192, 193, 222. Next, the last one is 224, 23, then 254. So, yun po ang ating Class C subnetting table. I hope ay natutunan po ninyo.
We hope you've learned how to do a subnetting. Thanks for watching!